Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are working our way through the text of the Pentateuch, following an annual cycle of readings. We are presently in our book of Leviticus, pertaining to the Levites. We're working through the book of Vayikra, as it's called in Judaism and by the Jewish people and many people who follow faith Hebraica, let's call it. And the reading per our schedule, according to the annual cycle of readings, is Amor. Amor. It's tied to the root word Amar, which means to speak or to say. And it covers the text from Leviticus chapter 21 all the way through chapter 24. All of those chapters are covered in this parsha. Now, within this parsha, within Amor, between Leviticus chapter 21, 22, 23, 24, we have a lot of different material, assorted laws and regulations and so forth. Chapter 21 deals primarily with rules that pertain specifically to the priest, the sons of Aaron. They include certain disqualifying factors, bodily defects that would preclude someone from participating in the priesthood. And as I read that last night, I thought that in the modern world, they would be putting themselves up for a lawsuit if you read chapter 21 of Leviticus. Chapter 22 deals primarily with rules that are concerning holy things, and then it also contains disqualifying factors similar to those that apply to the priest, but these disqualifying factors concern sacrifices or offerings, that the sacrifices and offerings can't have any type of defect, just like the priesthood. So those things are worth a study. We won't be talking about that today. There are other rules in chapter 22 associated with sacrifices and offerings. Chapter 23 deals with the festival calendar. Put a little tick mark by that one because I'll come back to that. Chapter 24 deals with the oil for the lights or for the menorah. And then we move into, in chapter 24, also these memorial loaves of bread. And then following that is a story of a blasphemer who dies for his crime. And there are other laws that round out the Torah portion, Amor, that deal with various laws, including the famous well-known eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. All of these things would be good and fitting for instruction. But what I decided to focus on today will be primarily from and about the context of Leviticus chapter 23, because I want to deal today with the Moed Yehovah, the festivals or the feast of the Lord, as it appears in many translations. So we're going to work today on the Moed. The Moed is the word of the day. So we're going to begin in chapter 23 of Leviticus, and I'd like you to go there with me this morning. So let's begin there. Let's open up Leviticus chapter 23, and I just want to kick us off by reading the first verse. Leviticus chapter 23 and 1 says, And Vayidaber Yehovah el Moshe lemor, and Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy gatherings, these are my feasts. The feast of the Lord. So we're talking about the feast of the Lord. Now, where the word feast is in your translation, or it might say festivals, I think a lot of them say festivals, the first thing I want to point out is that the word there is Moed. Now, Moed is in the construct. It leads us to the next word, the feast of the Lord. It's tied to the root word or to the base word in this sentence, Moed, and a Moed is typically understood to be an appointment, an assembly, a meeting. And it can be used, Moed can be used to denote both time and place. Think about an appointment. It's an appointment. So if you have an appointment with a doctor or an appointment with a lawyer, any of those type of things, you have a place and a time. Well, the Hebrew word Moed can denote both just in that same way. Context determines what we're talking about here. But whenever we deal with Levitical literature, at times both are implied by the context. So you'll see that as we work through. Now I want to focus just for a minute off the topic, just a little bit, because I want to talk about this word Moed. Whenever we talk about the place or a structure, you all are familiar with the term Ohelmo Aid. Typically is translated the tent of meeting. Ohel is tent. Moed, again, it means meeting or appointment. So it's an appointment tent. It's the place of meeting, and how often do we see that to be the case as we work through the biblical literature, particularly in the Pentateuch, as we'll see. But Ohelmo Aid, that phrase, occurs in 140 verses in the Hebrew Bible, 149 verses. 140 verses. 129 of those, so the majority, the vast majority, occur in the Pentateuch. So we see almost exclusively the use of Ohelmo Aid in the 5 books. Now, interestingly enough, and this makes a lot of sense as you study the sources of the Pentateuch, the phrase Ohelmo Aid occurs 129 times in the 5 books. How many of those are in the book of Deuteronomy? And you just put that answer on your paper and don't cheat and send it to me because I want to see how close you got. One time. One time, Ohelmo Aid occurs in the book of Devarim in Deuteronomy. So I'd like you to go with me this morning to Deuteronomy chapter 31. Deuteronomy 31, and I'm going to read verse 14. Again, the reason I'm talking about this is because I want to show the understanding of Moed, because we're dealing with the Moedei Yehovah. So if you look at 31:14, and the Lord said to Moses, Vayomer Yehovah el Moshe, behold, your days approach that you must die. Call Yehoshua and present yourselves in the Ohelmo Aid, in the tent of meeting, that I may give him a charge. And Moses and Yehoshua went and presented themselves in the Ohelmo Aid, the tent of meeting. Now, interestingly enough, and I want to point this out because I think it's very important, the Ohelmo Aid here in Deuteronomy 31:14 is not the Ohelmo Aid of priestly literature. There are 2 Ohelmo Aids. One is located in the center of the camp, and it is also known as the Mishkan, the Mikdash. It's the place, the tabernacle, if you will. That is also referred to as Ohelmo Aid. But this is a different tent. This is a different tent, and we're going to find that, another example of that, in the book of Exodus. So I want you to see that there are 2 tents. Go with me to Exodus chapter 33. Now this Ohelmo Aid is a place where Moses and Joshua meet, and I want you to look at Exodus 33 to underscore this. Exodus 33, beginning in verse 7. And Moses would take the tent. And Moses would take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, afar off from the camp, and he called it the Ohelmo Aid. And it came to pass that everyone who sought Jehovah went out to the Ohelmo Aid, which was outside the camp. And it came to pass when Moses went out to the tent, the Ohel, that all the people rose up and stood, every man at his tent door, and looked after Moses until he was gone into the Ohel. And it came to pass, as Moses entered the Ohel, the cloud pillar descended and stood at the door of the Ohel, and one talked with Moses, and all the people saw the cloudy pillar stand at the door of the Ohel. And all the people rose up and worshipped, every man in his tent door. And the Lord, Jehovah, spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Or the King James puts it, as a man speaketh. And he turned back to the camp, but his servant Yehoshua the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart out of the tent. So we have two tents. We have a tent, the Ohelmo Aid, that's also known as the Mishkan, the Mikdash. It's located in the center of the camp. Open any good study Bible and you'll see a nice diagram of that Ohel. But this tent is outside the camp. It is also known as a tent of meeting. So we have two tents, two Ohelmo Aids, mixing English and Hebrew there. And the reason I want to bring this up is because it's important that we recognize that within the Pentateuch, we often will encounter words or phrases or designations that are often used by different authors to indicate different things. So in other words, if you make a chart and you say, I want to look at every occurrence of Ohelmo Aid, the tent of meeting, and you write, you get to Exodus 33, for instance, and you say, okay, where's it located? It's outside the camp. Well, that's not the other Ohelmo Aid that's inside the camp. Don't mix up the two tents, which reminds me, I once heard Richard Elliott Friedman giving a lecture. And Friedman said, I'm going to start off by telling a joke. So I'm going to use his joke. This is a scholar's joke, so don't be prepared to like roll on the floor laughing. But I thought it was pretty good. Richard Elliott Friedman said, Moses went to a psychiatrist. He goes in the office, he reclines on the couch. The doc says, Moses, what are you in here for? He said, last 2 nights I've had some troubling dreams. I need your help. He said, well, what were the dreams of? He said, well, the first night I dreamed that I was the Ohelmo Aid. The doctor looked at him and he said, and if that wasn't enough, the next night I dreamed again. And in the second dream, Doc, I was the Mishkan. I need your help. What can I do about this troubling dream that occurs again and again? He said, oh, it's easy. He said, the problem, Moses, get ready for this, is that you're two tents. Now, if you didn't get that, you have a couple of options. If you're on a Mac device, go up to the upper left and click the red dot. If you're on a Windows-based machine, click the X in the upper right. Just joking. Don't go anywhere. I'm not saying that scholar jokes are the greatest, but I do think it's interesting because it brings up a very significant point. And the point being that oftentimes we make associations when we look at the text and we see tent of meeting, tent of meeting, tent of meeting, and we say, all of these apply to the same tent. Hear me, not always is that the case. At times, tent of meeting is not the tent of meeting that you might think. So you have to be clear in your mind. You have to get your two tents right. Now, I wanted to bring this up because at times we're dealing with faulty translations or assumptions from the text, but at other times we might be viewing in some way evidence of different sources. And in this particular case, that is what we see. In one particular source, the tent of meeting is a special tent that Moses has outside the camp. The other is a tent of meeting, also known, a.k.a. Mishkan, and so forth. Now, we're talking today, and we're basing our class on something that Vayikra, that Leviticus 23 calls the Moed, or the Moed, the Moeds, make it plural, of Jehovah. Perhaps no other subject or let me put it this way, perhaps more than any other subject in the Bible, the festivals seem to be the cause of debate more than anything else among various factions and groups who seek or sought to live their life according to the text of the Hebrew Bible. And this is the case. It's proven over and over again. You can study ancient literature. You can study the Hebrew Bible. You can study the Christian writings. They deal with debates over these festivals as well. You can study Jewish literature, the Talmud, and the debates about the festival dates and when does the month start, and et cetera, et cetera. We'll see some of that. But without seeking to fully convince you today in this particular class about this point, I will submit that the reason there are so many debates, ancient times up through modern times, when dealing with the festivals and the proper execution or the proper participation, the proper keeping of these festivals, is because the texts themselves lend themselves to present difficulties to the seeker. There are ambiguities within the text dealing with these festivals, and that's primarily because we're dealing with a vast collection of writings, multiple traditions presented by many varied authors over a long period of time, and all of these opinions and traditions are combined, thank God, in this one sacred history book. We get to read the debates and the disagreements within the text. We are dealing today with the appointed times. Now, they are called at times by different names and different authors, different names, and this adds to the confusion. Now, I do want to say this. An interesting fact, the subject that I'm talking about today, about the calendar and about the festivals, even though that brings about in some cases division or argument or debate, it also, in many ways, draws us to the text of the Hebrew Bible and to Hebrew faith. I can't tell you over the years how many times people have told me, I was in another faith and I began to study and seek and I began to study about the festivals. And the festivals are what drew me to the Hebrew faith. I think many of you who are watching me or listening to me on the podcast would identify with that and say, that's what it was for me. I began to recognize that these biblical feasts and festivals and holidays were different than those with which I grew up. And so a lot of people are drawn into a way of Hebraic faith because of the very thing which later they join in fights about. By the way, if you've ever been to like a Sukkot gathering, seated around a table, and someone brings up, a certain disagreement, well, actually, the new moon is this or the new moon is that, or have you ever gotten into one of those debates? How about the lunar Sabbath versus this Sabbath, or the counting of the days of the 50 days? When does the count start? Look, you can really be up on all of these different points and have some fun because you don't have anywhere to go. You're sleeping in a tent, so you can just stir the crowd up all night with these kind of things. But many people, what draws them to the faith is a realization, and it's been told to me countless times. It's usually like this. They say, I guess I thought at one point that these festivals were for the Jews. They were the Jewish feast. But then I realized that Leviticus 23 calls them the feast of the Lord, the Moed Yehovah. And so a lot of people then interpret that and say, well, these don't necessarily just apply to a certain group of people, but they apply to God's ways, and therefore they're important to study. These or the Moed Yehovah. These are the appointed times, the seasons of Jehovah. Go with me this morning to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. You might as well start in the beginning if you're doing a Bible study, right? Genesis 1 and verse 14. Genesis 1:14. And God said, Vayomer Elohim, Yehi Morot, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon earth. And it was so. Now, if you look at these words that are used in Genesis 1:14, the word for seasons is Moadim. Let them, the lights in the heavens, the big light, the greater light and the lesser light, and they will be Leotot for signs, Ul Moadim, and for seasons or appointed times, Ul Yamim V'Shanim, and for days and for years. So what we learn from the beginning, from Genesis, is that two great lights are going to be involved not only in giving light to the earth, which is one of their main points, but they are also going to be used in the governance of the determination of these appointed times that God is going to give His people. Now, by the way, I wanted to make another point from a linguistic standpoint, from the idea of Moed, appointment, and so forth. Whenever it can mean an assembly, and the group, the congregation, the word that's often translated congregation, the community, the assembly, the community of Israel, assembly of Israel, that is the Edah. The Edah. And an Edah, an assembly, is the same, tied to the same root idea in Hebrew as Moed. So an assembly does what? They assemble. And they assemble at an assembly time. Now, these festivals, I'm going to give you some general terms and concepts first. According to Vayikra, the Levitical literature, Vayikra 23, it also refers to these as Mikra Kodesh. Mikra Kodesh. And that means something like holy callings. Mikra, kara means to read or to call. So it's a calling. What is a calling? Kodesh means holy. So these are like holy callings, i.e. a call to assemble. Does that make sense? So these festivals are called Mikra Kodesh, which means it's somehow you would call people to assemble, and we think that, based on Levitical literature, that it was probably announced by trumpet. Go with me this morning to the book of Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 10. Numbers chapter 10. Verses 1 and 2. Vaydaber Yehovah el Moshe lemor, and Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, make thee 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shall you make them, that you shall use them for the calling, or for calling the assembly. Lemikra ha'edah. Now, again, edah is tied to the same root word as moed. So what do? How do you get, according to the Levitical literature, 603,550 males, plus women, children, etc.? How do you notify this group that you're about to have an assembly? You announce it by silver trumpets. And this sound would reverberate through the wilderness, and the people would know. And then it goes on in Numbers chapter 10, and it tells details about if you hear this blast, what does it mean? And you hear that blast. So it's like people would listen and they'd say, oh, it's time to move. It's time to assemble. So these are the Mikra Kodesh. Now, again, Leviticus calls the Moed Yehovah, the festivals or feasts of the Lord, the appointments of Jehovah, calls them Mikra Kodesh. That phrase is used 18 times in Scripture, once in Exodus chapter 12, verse 16. Most of the occurrences happen in Leviticus 23, and then you have a few in Numbers 28 and 29, which are, in a way, associated priestly instructions. Numbers 28 and 9 also gives us instruction about the Moed Yehovah, and it works as a compendium to Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus 23 is a distinctive piece of priestly literature that provides an overview of the holy days, let's say. So what are the holy days that are given in Leviticus chapter 23? Now, I'm not going to read all of Leviticus 23, and the people said amen. But I am going to encourage you to read Leviticus 23 on your own today, particularly today, because this weekend this is the Torah portion. But here's what's covered. I'm going to give you an overview, and then I'm going to take this and break it down a little bit. So what's covered in Leviticus chapter 23? In Leviticus chapter 23, we have the seventh-day Sabbath kicks us off. Now, a lot of people don't think of the Sabbath as one of the appointments of Jehovah, but I want you to understand, it not only is an appointment of Jehovah, but it is singled out as the first one mentioned. And oh, by the way, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments. It's the only one that made the top 10 list. God wrote this one with his own finger on tablets of stone. So this is not just some, well, you know, it's Sabbath. I mean, it's every week, but the repetition, the weekly repetition of Shabbat every week, is because of its singular importance and significance, I believe. So we begin with the seventh-day Sabbath. The next thing listed is Pesach on the 14th day of the first Hebrew month. This then is followed by what's called Chag Hamatzot, the festival of the unleavened bread. We're going to talk details about Chag in a little while. Unleavened bread is a 7-day festival that begins on the 15th of the 7th month and lasts for 7 days, right? Or the first month, sorry. Now, then you have, after that, now I'm just giving it to you the way Leviticus 23 does. So some of you are already connecting Leviticus 23 with other passages. Don't do that yet. So in other words, you know that this one is called Chag Hamatzot. The next one listed is a harvest when you do your harvest. It's not named, but there is a clue. It talks about the first sheaf, okay? And then you have this other thing, another appointment that is called, it deals with counting of 50 days after waving of the first sheaf. Well, what day do you wave the first sheaf? Now, I know people have this all worked out in their mind, but I challenge you to go back and look at these details I'm bringing up. After you wave the first sheaf, the counting is to commence from the morrow after the Sabbath. Well, what's meant? This is one of the great debates of all time. What Sabbath? Are we talking about the regular weekly Sabbath? You know, the weekly Sabbath, or are we talking about a special Sabbath that occurs during the Passover unleavened bread season? Which one is it? How do you count the 50. We're not going to work on that so much today. But one of the features of this festival, this Chag, is at the conclusion of the 50 days, we have 2 loaves, bikurim liYehovah. Bikurim is like the first, okay? The chosen. It's also called a Mikra Kodesh, but otherwise, this 50 days is not named, all right? Now you say, yeah, but what about, and you're thinking of other verses. I'm only in Leviticus 23 right now. Then you have the first day of the 7th month. The first day of the 7th month, you are to have a, get this term, a Shabbaton Zikron Teruah, often translated the feast of or festival of trumpets, right? Now, but other than that, we don't know much about that. What do you do? What is a Shabbaton? Zikron means a memorial, and then you have this idea of Teruah. Teruah can be a blast of a trumpet can make the sound Teruah, but does it mean a trumpet? Where else do we read about this particular Shabbaton Zikron Teruah? Where else do we read about it that could shed some light on it? Then you have Yom HaKippurim. How many of you have heard of Yom Kippur? Biblically, it's called Yom HaKippurim, the Day of the Coverings. Day of the Coverings. It's on the 10th day of the 7th month, and we get this feature that one is to afflict the soul during this time, or afflict yourself. And people have interpreted that to mean by way of fasting. And there is that evidence in the Bible where fasting can afflict the soul, or it is associated with affliction of the soul, but it's not always. In other words, you can fast and just go through the motions, read Isaiah 58, and you can be doing it for nothing because you're not really achieving. You can go without eating a pack of Oreos or something, but that doesn't necessarily put you in the right place physically or spiritually, I should add. And then finally, rounding out the Moed Yehovah is Chag HaSukkot, which begins on the 15th of the 7th month. It lasts 7 days, and it commemorates something. Not all of these, we're not always told what they represent or what they commemorate. But look with me at 23 of Leviticus and chapter 23, verse 42. You shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are homeborn in Israel shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God. And then it ends, Leviticus 23 ends this way. And Moses declared to the children of Israel, the Moed Yehovah. The Moed Yehovah. Now, earlier, when I talked about this 7th month, first day of the month, Shabbaton Zikron Teruah, known as the Festival of Trumpets. The Day of the Blast is probably better. Day of the Memorial Blast or sound. By the way, in Hebrew, sometimes Teruah can be a shout. Doesn't have to be just a trumpet. But we encounter a word several times in Vayikra, in Leviticus 23, and that word is Shabbaton. Shabbaton. But what is Shabbaton? Okay. It's typically translated as complete rest. In fact, a lot of times you'll see it, it appears in the text as Shabbat Shabbaton. Shabbat Shabbaton. Now, there's a lot of disagreement in lexical aids. If you begin to do a study, if you look up Shabbat Shabbaton, you're going to see that scholars aren't in total agreement as to what this means. It's interesting. It's interesting to try to work through this. But it seems to denote, primarily because you've heard me say this piece of grammar, a construct state. Shabbat, which means to cease or to stop. A lot of times people translate it as rest, which couldn't be partly derived from this idea, but it really means to stop, cease. So what does it mean when you say Shabbat, Shabbaton? Shabbaton is seemingly based on the same basic root, Shin Beit Tav, and Shabbat, where it says Shabbat, Shabbaton, Shabbat is in the construct. So it means Shabbat of Shabbaton. Or perhaps, as many scholars say, it could be a Sabbath of Sabbaths, or a Sabbath of Sabbath. And what they get from that, if you look this up, you're going to find that most people believe that it's indicative of a special Sabbath, a strict observance, a Sabbath in which the adherence to strictness is especially called out. So a Shabbaton seems to be a very strictly observed special Sabbath, and it's used several times, and let's look at some of those. So open up again, if you've closed off, to go to Leviticus 23. I tried to pull things out and talk about today on festivals, things that you may or may not have studied in depth, rather than just hit the normal stuff that you might look at. So in 23, chapter 23, let's look at verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy gathering. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to Jehovah in all your dwellings. Now in Hebrew, this particular passage says that the seventh day is a Shabbat Shabbaton. Now a lot of people associate other festivals with the Shabbaton, this strictly observed special Sabbath. But they often miss the fact that the weekly Sabbath is a Shabbat Shabbaton. If Shabbat Shabbaton means a strictly observed, a Sabbath of Sabbath, and it's listed first, and it's the only festival, the only appointment that God gives us in the 10 words, His testimony, written by His own hand, then doesn't that elevate its importance and its significance? The first thing Leviticus 23 talks about is God's Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. It's kept every week, and it is a Shabbat Shabbaton. Now, look at verse 32. Chapter 23, verse 32, this is, it says, it shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest. Notice it's translating there, Shabbat Shabbaton. And you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath. In fact, there it doesn't say you shall celebrate. It says, Tishbatu Shabbatchem. You shall Sabbath your Sabbath, right? So it's an indication that this is, look, there's a ceasing and there's a ceasing. And you're going to cease to cease. You're going to just stop. A total stopping, if you will. We say that sometimes, total stop. Now, so Shabbat Shabbaton is used to describe in Leviticus 23 the weekly Sabbath and Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonements. Both of these are singled out of all the feasts and festivals and etc. Now, also, I should point out, go with me to Exodus 31. Exodus 31, and verse 15. We're focusing on Shabbaton. Exodus 31:15. It says, 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to Jehovah. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. 6 days, in Hebrew, it's Sheshet Yamim Ya'aseh Malakah Uvayom Hashvi'i Shabbat Shabbaton. The seventh day, but the seventh day is a Shabbat Shabbaton. Now look at 35:2, Exodus 35 and verse 2. Exodus 35:2. Let's do verse 1, Exodus 35:1 and 2. Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said to them, these are the words which Jehovah has commanded that you should do them. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does work on it shall be put to death. All right? So again, a Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath is called Shabbat Shabbaton. Now look at one more. Go with me to Exodus 16. Exodus 16, verse 23. By the way, the one Moed, the one Moed of Jehovah that is singled out more than any other as a Shabbat Shabbaton is the weekly Sabbath. By far. Exodus 16, verse 23. It says, and he said to them, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and what you will boil today, and that which remains over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. So the holy Sabbath to the Lord, this time it says, Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh. So it switches the order. The interesting thing about Exodus 16, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this today, I've covered it in other classes, is that the text appears strangely. They're not at Sinai yet. They've not heard the 10 words. And yet, they're given this lesson on keeping Shabbat. Now, some have proposed that is intentional, that it indicates that the Sabbath was known much earlier. But we have to wonder on that, but that's for your contemplation later. Now, there's one other occurrence of Shabbat Shabbaton, and that's in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25. And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath to the Lord. So this is interesting. Not only do you keep a Sabbath, but the land keeps a Sabbath. Listen to this. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruit. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath for Jehovah. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. That which grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap nor gather, etc. In other words, you're going to let this land lie fallow. It's just going to lie there for that year, for the Sabbath year. But it's a Sabbath for the land. It's not every week. It's not every year. It's every 7 years. This is called the Yuval, the Jubilee, Leviticus 25:4. Now, 3 other occurrences of Shabbaton, and that is where Shabbaton occurs alone, not with Shabbat. And Shabbaton occurs alone in 16:31 of Leviticus 16:31, and there it speaks of Yom HaKippurim. We've already seen that at times Yom HaKippurim is called Shabbat Shabbaton. It's the same in Leviticus 23, but here it's just called a Shabbaton. And then in Leviticus 23 we have three other days that are called Shabbaton. The first one is Shabbaton Zikron Truah. That's our Feast of Trumpets Day. And that's in Leviticus 23:24. And then in Leviticus 23:39, two other days are referred to as Shabbaton. Now, if Shabbaton means strictly observed ceasings, what are those 2 days? The first and the 8th day of Sukkot. So you see this, you have this idea of Shabbaton. It occurs over and over, but the one thing that I think people need to pay attention to, all of it we should pay attention to, but in particular, let's think about the strictness that Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat, is attributed in the text by being referred to as Shabbaton. Now there's another term we meet. So you see we're starting to collect. They're called Mikra Kodesh, they're called Moed, they're called Shabbaton. At times we get this term Chag. Now what is Chag? You hear people say, Chag Sukkot Sameach. Chag. What is Chag? In Leviticus 23, let's look at the appearance of Chag. In 23 and verse 6, we read, on the 15th day of the same month is the Chag Hamatzot. Chag, the unleavened bread. The unleavened bread, Chag, whatever Chag is. And then in verse 34, we only have one other festival that's referred to as Chag in Leviticus 23, and it occurs in 3 verses, Leviticus 23, 34, 39, and 41. It's Chag HaSukkot. Chag HaSukkot. Now the word Chag appears in 55 verses in the Tanakh. 55 verses we get the word Chag. Deuteronomy uses it 7 times. Now this all is going to tie together nicely, as you'll see. In chapter 16, we get Chag occurring 6 times in Deuteronomy and once in chapter 31. So here's what you get out of Deuteronomy. You get Sukkot, which is referred to as a Chag in Leviticus 23. You get unleavened bread, which is known by Leviticus 23 as a Chag. And you get something else in Deuteronomy that's not referred to as a Chag in Leviticus 23. Well, that's the one I'm interested in, because why doesn't Leviticus 23 call it a Chag? And why does Deuteronomy call it a Chag? And what is it that Deuteronomy identifies as a Chag that doesn't make that status in Leviticus 23? Look at Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 10. 16 and verse 10. And you shall keep the Chag, Shavuot. Shavuot. Now, what is Chag Shavuot? Shavuot is typically translated as weeks. Now we have to wonder, why isn't it called a Chag in Leviticus 23? Chag, first of all, what does Chag mean? It comes from the word Chagag, and it's typically translated pilgrim feast or pilgrimage festival or something of that nature. But it ties to the idea, we believe, linguists believe, it ties to the idea of twirling or reeling. You know, so the idea could be that of dancing. Imagine if you're part of this great festival and you're reeling around and twirling, and that's the idea that most often is associated with a Chag. So it's a time of dancing and celebratory features of this festival. You remember in Sukkot particularly, you have that you are to be joyful. It's commanded joy, we could call it. Now, according to the biblical writers, there are 3 Hagim that require all males to appear before the Lord at the place appointed, and they're not to come empty-handed. Now later that becomes Jerusalem, but at the time that the Pentateuch sources allegedly are written, they're not in Jerusalem, right? But this idea is wherever God will place His name. 3 times in a year, all males will go to appear before the Lord. Now, what I need you to do, and I'm going to quickly go through this, but I want you to study this on your own. We're going to do a horizontal chart. You're going to do a horizontal chart if you really want to get this, because I want to show you a few things, and it only shows up if you look at things side by side. So don't imagine, get a piece of paper and a pen, and make 3 columns on a sheet of paper, equally divided. Column number 1 on the left, I want you to write Exodus 23, 14 through 17, because we're dealing with the pilgrimage festivals. So I want you to compare what these 3 passages say about it. Exodus 23, 14 through 17, left-hand column. Middle column, Exodus 34, 18 through 23. And then on the right-hand column, you're going to write Deuteronomy 16. And it's scattered throughout Deuteronomy 16. And what you're going to do is you're going to read through these. So I'm going to go through quickly. Go with me to Exodus 23, verse 14. And it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me, a Chag. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. So what you're going to do is you're going to write 3 feasts in the year. You're going to write number 1 is going to be what? Chag HaMatzot, the feast of unleavened bread. And then it says, parentheses, you shall eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded you in the time appointed of the month of Aviv. For in it you did come out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. And number 2, the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in your field, the feast of ingathering, which is at the end of the year, when you have gathered in your labors out of the field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither fat of sacrifice remain until the morning, etc. So column number 1 is going to have 3 times Chag to me, basically. 3 Chagim, 3, all right? And then number 1 is Chag HaMatzot, the Chag, the whirling or the festival of unleavened bread. Number 2 is called here Chag HaKatzir. Katzir is harvest. So it's a feast of harvest, and it has something to do with the first fruits of your work. So all that's number 2. Number 2 is Chag HaKatzir. Number 3 is called in Hebrew Chag HaAsif. It's to be held at the going out of the year, the B'tzat HaShana, the going out of the year. So again, you have 3 festivals. You got to appear before all males. Males have to appear before the Lord. And you have those listed. Now, look at Exodus 34. It's just a couple of chapters later. Remember I said that sometimes part of the confusion and disagreement comes in because things are worded slightly differently by different authors or different sources. Exodus 34, verse 18. Feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you in the time of the month of Aviv. For in the month of Aviv you did come out from Egypt. Now I'm going to skip down. Look at verse 21. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In plowing and harvest you shall rest, and you shall observe the feast of weeks, and the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God, the God of Israel. Now here's what I want you to get. we have a tendency to conflate these texts and not identify differences. So like if you read Exodus 24 and Exodus 23 and you work your way through 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. By the time you get to 34, how likely are you going to remember the exact wording? You're not. What you're going to say is, oh, here we go. 3 times in the year all males are going to, because that's almost exact. What's different? This is why horizontal reading is important. So you look, and sure enough, we agree, column number 2 in the middle, Exodus 34, just like Exodus 23, begins with Chag HaMatzot. Now this time, the second one listed is not called Chag HaKatzir, it's called Chag Shavuot. Shavuot. Now, by the way, that indicates 50, but it's also, many people know it as Pentecost, because Penta in Greek is associated with 50. So again, now it's called Chag HaKatzir and Chag Shavuot in Exodus 23 and 34. Both of these are the same, though, clearly, because it deals with the first fruits of the harvest. And then finally, number 3, the third Chag is called Ha'asif. Now this one doesn't say at the going out of the year, it uses a different phrase, and this is what you'll notice when you do your chart. It's called here the turning of the year, the Techufat HaShanah, the turning of the year. I think it's the same, but it's a different phrase for it. Like if you begin and you work your way month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you turn. Because Hebrew calendar needs to be understood not as linear, but as cyclical. So it's the going out of the year. You get 6 months into the year, and you start making your way back to the beginning of the year. See? It's a cycle. Same thing if you say at the going out of the year is going out, we're coming back around. Deuteronomy 16 now. And you'll get more of this when you do your chart. In verses 1 through 8 of Deuteronomy 16, we deal with Passover and Chag HaMatzot. And they seem to be conflated here, whereas that's not the case in all other places in the Bible. You want an interesting study, which I don't have time to get into today. Do research on when did Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread become one. Because originally, look at Leviticus 23, they appear to be separate. But by the time you see this in Deuteronomy 16, there's a merging that takes place. So you begin with the 7 days of eating matzah. Well, guess what? That ties with the other 2 passages. So you have Chag HaMatzot. The second thing we deal with is Shavuot, which ties with Chag HaKatzir in Exodus 23 and Shavuot in Exodus 34. And then number 3 is referred to as Sukkot, but we also know that it's tied to the Chag HaAsif, the gathering at the end of the year, the turning of the year. So we have these 3 festivals, these 3 pilgrimage festivals, which are very important in the agricultural year, and these are part of the broader idea of keeping the festivals. These are sacred appointments. They're to be kept, notice, throughout your generations. How many times do we see that? Sometimes we get an indication like Leviticus 23:42 and following that the reason you camp out in a tent is not just because camping is fun, but it's to remind you that the children of Israel were in tents when they left Egypt, right? So they're tied to historic and salvific moves of God. Okay, the weekly Sabbath. I want to go back and touch a couple of points here as I get ready to wrap things up. The weekly Sabbath is the only one of all the festivals, the feasts, that is included in the Big Ten. Exodus 20, go with me there. Exodus 20, and beginning in verse 8, Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. L'kadsho. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh is a Sabbath to Jehovah your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your maidservant, nor your manservant, nor your cattle, nor the strangers within your gates. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. A couple of quick points. The Sabbath is associated with God's creative work. And it's the day on which God stops his creative work and he sanctifies the Sabbath day, which means this is the first occurrence of the word holy in all of Scripture. So the first thing that God calls holy is the Sabbath day. Listen, time is the first thing called holy, set apart. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 5. Go with me to Deuteronomy 5. I keep looking at my phone because I hear text messages. I thought my daughter is like really due. She's overdue a week. So I'm making sure that there's not a note that says, hurry up and come see the baby. All right, Deuteronomy 5:12. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as Jehovah your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Jehovah your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your maidservant, your manservant, nor your ox, nor your ass, nor any of your cattle, nor the strangers within your gates, and that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you. Now I wanted to stop there for a minute. A lot of people think the Sabbath is so I can rest, and that's true. But Deuteronomy makes it very clear it's also so that others can rest. You say, what's the harm if I go out on the Sabbath and, I'm giving you their view. I'm not saying that I'm so shomer Shabbat, but I'm saying you go, well, why can't I go to a place where other people are working? Well, you then participate in their working. You see, that's the idea. You get a waiter to go get you some food, you're causing that person to wait. So the idea is that you take off Shabbat and you let others take off Shabbat. And remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and that Jehovah your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and stretched out arm. Therefore Jehovah your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now what's obvious here, and I've pointed this out in my other series on the 10 words, is Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 don't agree. They both claim to be the words of God at Sinai on the day of assembly, out of the midst of the fire, written on tables of stone, but they read differently. There are a lot of different apologetic ways to make this work. But what I want you to notice today is that the creation, Exodus 20 ties Shabbat to the creation narrative and the holiness of that day. Deuteronomy ties it to redemption and freedom and indicates that the day is associated with liberation. So think of both. Think of the Shabbat as a holy day to relax and refresh yourself from a busy week, just like God did, imitating God basically, but also you're imitating being redeemed and you're free. You're free. A lot of memes on Facebook show people leaving out of work on Friday and their hands are raised, free at last, almost quoting Martin Luther King Jr. It's like, I'm out of here. Well, that's the way we feel when we enter into Shabbat, and it's the way we should feel. So respect it as not only as a day of holiness set apart from the rest of the week, but as a day of liberation and freedom, not just for you, but for other people. And oh, by the way, your animals. Like you can't hook your animal up to a treadmill to do the grain for you on Sabbath while you kick back and relax. Notice it includes the animals in this. All benefit, human and animal benefit, and it has the power to transform the world. Think about this. What if everybody in your town took Shabbat and just relaxed? You think that would help? Isaiah 56. Isaiah 56. And I want to begin in verse 1. Thus says Jehovah, keep judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed. Happy is the man who does this, and the Son of Man that lays hold on it, that keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger that's joined himself to Jehovah speak, saying, Jehovah shall surely separate me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. For thus says Jehovah to the eunuch that keeps my Sabbath, and chews the things that please me, and takes hold of my covenant. To them will I give in my house and within my walls a memorial better than sons and daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also, the sons of the stranger that join themselves to Jehovah, to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants. Everyone that keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and all that hold fast to my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Burnt offering and sacrifices shall be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. If someone tells you that the Sabbath is not for you because you're not of a certain people, you can tell them, thank you for your opinion, but I choose to believe Isaiah, who's speaking on behalf of Jehovah. Sabbath is like other good things and laws and principles within the Hebrew Bible. It is meant to change our world, which God knows needs changing. These concepts, these festivals are universal in their aspect and can be adopted by people around the world. Josephus wrote in Against Apian 2.282, if you want to look this up. There's not one city, says Josephus, Greek or barbarian, nor a single nation to which our custom of abstaining from work on the seventh day has not spread. A lot of teachers say, the Sabbath isn't for you. The Sabbath isn't for me. Mind your own business. According to God, it is. Sukkot is also clearly shown to be universal. Read Zechariah 14. It comes on the heels of a great battle. Zechariah 14 brings us into verse 9, which talks about, in that day, Jehovah will be king over all the earth. He will be one and his name one. This indicates that the entirety of the earth, formerly, according to Micah 4, people will walk each in the name of its own God. But by Zechariah 14, there's one God. And this is Zechariah 14:9 is a universal Shema. Now, what does that bring about? The whole world, the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. You know what that means? That means in Zimbabwe, people will be keeping the festivals. In Vietnam, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you name it. Louisiana. People from all over the world will be keeping Torah because they recognize the benefit of doing these holy, righteous, life-giving principles. They recognize that it has the power to change the world, and they do so. In Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 19, it describes after this great war that delegates will be sent from every nation to Jerusalem to worship Jehovah the King. And if you don't go, your nation gets no rain. So God is always about giving choices. You have the choice. You don't have to send anybody to worship Jehovah, but just be ready for a long, dry year. All humanity can benefit from observing the eternal ways of the Creator. And after all, Malachi tells clearly, if you didn't know, that we all have one God and one Father. All of humanity. But remember, don't forget, don't be haughty. Don't be arrogant. And listen, don't be overly convinced that you have the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that you know when the day starts because you properly read something that someone else couldn't read right, or that you know that the Jews are wrong and you have your calendar right, or that the Jews are right and everyone else is wrong. Don't be so confident that you've figured out these festivals without any error in your discerning, because the chances are all of us have problems in our understanding of these holy days. The Bible shows a history of failure when it comes to properly keeping what are supposed to be kept throughout your generations. In 622 BCE, when when Hilkiah discovers the scroll of the Torah of Moses and Josiah issues a reform from the capital, people go about, it says that they did a Passover. You know what it tells us in 2 Kings 23? That a Passover hadn't been kept properly since the days of the judges. And in 2 Chronicles 35, it says that this is 622 BCE, says that it hadn't been kept since the days of Samuel, the prophet. So don't get this idea that, well, you know, the people of Israel have kept these perfectly throughout the generations every year without exception. That just doesn't match history. But be like Hezekiah. Why Hezekiah? Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 30 recognized that the people hadn't kept, in this case, the festival of Pesach correctly. That's a big deal. You're not keeping it as written. And I want you to listen to his prayer, because this is what we ought to do. This is what we ought to pray. Rather than be arrogant and pompous and sticking our nose in the air like we've got it all figured out. Look at 2 Chronicles 30, verse 18. I'll tell you what was going on, and then you'll hear his prayer. For a multitude of the people, many of Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, so they did eat the Passover otherwise than it was written. In other words, they're not keeping it right. And Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, this is Hezekiah's prayer, it ought to be mine and yours as well. The good Lord, let me look at something here, verse 19. The good Lord pardon everyone who directs his heart to seek God, the Lord God of his fathers, though he be not cleansed according to the purification of the sanctuary. In other words, he's saying, I know they're not doing this right, but as King Hezekiah talked to God, he said, God, please recognize that these people are turning to you with their whole heart. They're seeking after you, and even though they're not doing this right, they think they are, by the way. They really do. They're probably even arrogant to their neighbors. Now look at verse 20. And Jehovah heard Hezekiah and healed the people. So I read all the time people debating about the festivals and, oh, you're wrong. This is when you start the count here and not there, and listen to how I do it. I'm doing it right. Hezekiah just looked at it a little bit more broadly and said, God, you're good. Please forgive this people for any missteps they may have committed, because they're trying to find you. Don't be too tense. Going back to the joke that I opened. Some of you may still be laughing from when I told it. Relax and seek God. Seek to follow his ways and trust that even if you fail, He will save you, and He'll begin to sanctify you if you let Him. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Have a beautiful week and be here next week. Same time, same channel.